My name is Rebecca Morgan. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. The night of my birthday dinner, I heard my mother whisper something to my father that would change everything. It was supposed to be a celebration, a rare moment when my family actually gathered together in one place without some hidden agenda. But I should have known better. In the Morgan family, nothing ever happened without a reason, without a plan, without someone pulling strings in the shadows. The restaurant my brother Nathan had chosen was the Sentinel Hotel's dining room, one of those upscale places in downtown Portland, where the chandeliers cost more than most people's cars, and the waiters spoke in hushed, reverent tones. I'd never been comfortable in places like this, even though I could afford them now. My apartment in the Pearl District wasn't cheap, and my job as a financial analyst paid well enough. But sitting there, surrounded by my family, I felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story. My mother, Patricia Morgan, sat across from me in a cream-colored blazer that probably cost $1,000. Her hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and her makeup was flawless in that way that takes an hour to achieve, but is supposed to look natural. She'd always been beautiful, my mother, but it was the kind of beauty that felt calculated, weaponized. Every smile, every gesture, every word carefully chosen for maximum effect. My father, Richard Morgan, sat at the head of the table like he always did. Even when it wasn't his table, his restaurant, his celebration, he had that businessman's posture, that way of taking up space that made everyone else feel smaller. His silver hair was combed back, his suit was tailored, and his watch caught the light every time he lifted his wine glass. He looked successful, powerful, and completely in control. And then there was Nathan, my older brother, 32 years old, and still living in Beaverton with our parents, still working at Dad's real estate company, still doing whatever they asked without question. He'd always been the good son, the obedient one, the one who never rocked the boat. I loved him, but I'd stopped respecting him years ago. The dinner had been pleasant enough, up to that point. We'd ordered appetizers, made small talk about the weather and traffic, and all those safe topics that families use to avoid talking about anything real. My son Caleb was with a babysitter back at my apartment, which was probably for the best. At 4 years old, he didn't need to be exposed to whatever dysfunction was brewing beneath the surface of this carefully orchestrated meal. I was cutting into my salmon when I heard it. My mother's voice, low and urgent, leaning toward my father but not quite quiet enough. "While everyone's here," she said, her eyes flicking toward me, and then away, "tell Nathan to go change the locks at her apartment." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. My father nodded, his expression unchanged, and turned to Nathan. "After dessert," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Do it quietly." Nathan's face went pale, but he nodded. He always nodded. The good son, the obedient soldier. I watched him excuse himself from the table, claiming he needed to make a phone call, and I saw the keys to my apartment complex jingling in his hand as he walked away. I should have said something right then. I should have demanded to know what they were doing, why they thought they had any right to access my home without my permission. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was curiosity, or maybe after 29 years of dealing with my parents' manipulations, I'd learned that sometimes the best strategy was to watch and wait, and let them reveal themselves. So I smiled. I cut another piece of salmon. I sipped my wine and made polite conversation with my mother about her garden club, and my father about the Portland real estate market. And I waited. Nathan was gone for an hour. When he came back, his face wasn't just pale anymore. It was ashen, like he'd seen something that had shaken him to his core. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his chair and sat down, and when my mother asked him, "Well, did you do it?" her voice sharp with impatience, he shook his head. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's police tape around her door." Every conversation at the table stopped. My father's wineglass froze midway to his lips. My mother's perfectly composed expression cracked, just for a moment, revealing something underneath that looked almost like fear. "What kind of joke is that?" my father demanded, his voice tight. Nathan shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "It's not a joke. There's an officer standing outside the apartment. He said no one's allowed in. He said there was an incident." The air in the restaurant seemed to change. It felt heavier, colder, electric with tension. My mother's face had drained of color beneath her carefully applied foundation. "What incident?" she asked, her voice no longer controlled, no longer perfectly modulated. But before Nathan could answer, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a notification from an unknown number. I picked it up, my heart suddenly pounding, and read the message that appeared. "Ms. Morgan, this is Officer Davis Grant from Portland Police Department. Please contact us immediately regarding your apartment at Pearl District." I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone in the restaurant turned to look, but I didn't care. "I have to go," I said, grabbing my purse. "Rebecca, what's going on?" my mother asked, but there was something in her voice that sounded less like concern and more like panic. I didn't answer. I just walked out of that restaurant, through the lobby of the Sentinel Hotel, out into the October night air that felt sharp against my skin. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my car keys, and my mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. If there was police tape at my apartment, something was very wrong, and the fact that my parents had sent Nathan to change my locks at the exact same time suggested they knew something I didn't. But what I didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning, and the truth waiting for me at home would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. By the time I reached my apartment building in the Pearl District, my heart was racing so fast I could hear it pounding in my ears. The normally quiet street was lit up with the red and blue lights of two patrol cars parked outside the entrance. Yellow police tape stretched across my doorway on the third floor, and a uniformed officer stood guard, his hand resting casually on his belt. I parked badly, probably in someone else's spot, and ran toward the building. My heels clicked against the pavement, and I was breathing hard by the time I reached the officer at the entrance. "I'm Rebecca Morgan," I said, trying to catch my breath. "This is my building. I got a message from Officer Grant." The officer at the entrance spoke into his radio, and within seconds, another officer appeared at the top of the stairs. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with a serious expression that didn't change when he saw me. "Ms. Morgan," he said, walking down to meet me. "I'm Officer Davis Grant. Thank you for coming so quickly." "What happened?" I asked, my voice higher than I wanted it to be. "Is my son okay?" The babysitter. "Your son is fine," he assured me immediately, and I felt something loosen in my chest. The babysitter called us when she noticed the door had been tampered with. "We've cleared the apartment, and both of them are safe at your neighbor's place." I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. Caleb was safe. That was all that mattered. But then the rest of Officer Grant's words registered. "Tampered with." He gestured for me to follow him up the stairs. "We received a report of a break-in attempt. Your door was forced open, but nothing appears to have been stolen. We've sealed the scene for investigation." As we climbed the stairs, my mind was spinning. A break-in? At my apartment? The same night my parents had sent Nathan to change my locks? That couldn't be a coincidence. When we reached my floor, I saw the yellow tape stretched across my doorway, and beyond it, I could see that my door was hanging slightly open, the frame around the lock splintered and damaged. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Officer Grant asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Anyone who would have access to your building? Any disputes with neighbors? Ex-partners? Anything like that?" I stared at the broken door, and suddenly everything clicked into place. "My brother," I said slowly. "Nathan Morgan. He has a key to the building. My mother sent him here tonight." Officer Grant's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me, his expression sharpening. "Your mother sent your brother to break into your apartment." "Not break in," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure anymore. "She told him to change my locks." I overheard them at dinner tonight. But he came back and said there was police tape. He said he didn't do anything. The officer studied me for a long moment. And I could see him processing this information, fitting it into whatever he already knew. Miss Morgan, he said carefully, your brother didn't break into your apartment. Someone else did. Before I could respond, another officer appeared in the doorway behind the tape. Grant, she called out. We've got a match on the prints inside. Sending the ID to command now. Officer Grant looked at me again, and something in his expression had changed. Miss Morgan, he said slowly, you might want to sit down for this. I didn't sit. I couldn't. I stood there in the hallway of my apartment building, under the harsh fluorescent lights, while Officer Grant told me that the fingerprints they'd found inside my apartment belonged to a man named Thomas Hale. The name meant nothing to me at first, just syllables without context. But then Officer Grant explained that Thomas Hale was the nephew of my landlord, that he'd been handling maintenance issues in the building, and that he was currently in custody downstairs. We found surveillance footage, Officer Grant continued, his voice professional but not unkind. He broke into your apartment last night, using a key copy. He's been under investigation for a series of unlawful entries across the complex. But this is the first time we've caught him in the act. My mind was reeling. Last night? But the babysitter called you tonight. The forced entry tonight was us. He explained. When your babysitter reported seeing someone inside earlier, we had to breach the door to secure the scene. The original break-in was more subtle. He had a key. I felt sick. Someone had been in my apartment, in my home, where my son slept, where I kept everything that mattered to me. What was he doing inside? I managed to ask. Officer Grant hesitated, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. You should see for yourself, he finally said. He led me past the police tape, into my apartment. It looked almost exactly as I'd left it that morning, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. Every framed photograph of me and Caleb had been turned face down, the pictures on the mantel, the ones on the bookshelf, even the small frame on the kitchen counter. All of them deliberately flipped. And on my coffee table, positioned exactly in the center, as if it had been staged, was a single white envelope. Don't touch it, Officer Grant said quickly as I moved toward it. We've already photographed it, but forensics needs to process it fully. But I could see what was inside through the partially open flap. A piece of paper, printed text, visible even from where I stood. Officer Grant pulled on a latex glove and carefully extracted the paper, holding it up so I could read it. The message was simple, just one sentence in Times New Roman font. Tell your mother the truth always finds its way home. I stared at those words, and the room seemed to tilt around me. Tell your mother, not me. My mother. This wasn't about me at all. This was about her. Miss Morgan, Officer Grant said quietly. Do you have any idea what this might mean? I did. Suddenly. Horribly. I did. But I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Wasn't ready to acknowledge what was becoming increasingly terrifyingly clear. So instead, I said, he wasn't breaking in to steal anything. He was delivering something. A message. Officer Grant studied me carefully. A message for who? I looked at him, and I could feel the weight of what I was about to say, the way it would change everything. For my mother, I said. And I think I know why. But what I didn't tell Officer Grant right then, what I couldn't bring myself to say in that moment, was that 3 months ago, while helping my parents move some boxes from their garage, I'd found something, a cardboard box labeled Richard's business papers that had been shoved into a corner, forgotten and dusty. I'd been looking for some old photo albums my mother had promised me, and I'd opened that box thinking it might be in there. Instead, I'd found property deeds. Lots of them. Properties in Bend, in Eugene, in Salem. All signed by both my parents. None of them ever mentioned in family conversations. And underneath those deeds, I'd found bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of, statements showing deposits and transfers that didn't match anything I knew about my father's real estate business. I hadn't said anything at the time. I'd closed the box, put it back, and tried to convince myself that there must be some reasonable explanation. That maybe these were legitimate business properties I just didn't know about. But I'd taken photos of some of the documents with my phone, just in case, just because something in my gut told me I might need them someday. And now, standing in my violated apartment, staring at that message on my coffee table, I realized that someday had arrived, because if someone had broken into my home to leave a message for my mother about truth finding its way home, then whatever was in that box wasn't legitimate business at all. It was something my parents had been hiding, something worth threatening me over, something worth hiring someone to retrieve. Officer Grant was still waiting for an answer, watching me with those sharp, assessing eyes that probably saw more than I wanted them to. "I need to make a phone call," I said. "To my mother." He nodded slowly. "That's fine. But Miss Morgan, if you know something about why someone would target you to get to your mother, I need you to tell me. This isn't just a break-in anymore. This is targeted harassment at minimum, possibly extortion, or witness intimidation." I almost laughed at that. Witness intimidation. If only he knew. "Can I see my son first?" I asked instead. He agreed, and within minutes, I was holding Caleb in my arms in my neighbor Mrs. Patterson's apartment. He was confused about why we couldn't go home, worried about his toys and his stuffed elephant that he couldn't sleep without. The babysitter, a college student named Emma, who I'd hired through an agency, was shaken but unharmed. She explained that she'd been putting Caleb to bed when she heard noises from the living room, and when she'd cautiously looked out, she'd seen a man in my apartment, going through my things. She'd grabbed Caleb, locked them both in the bedroom, and called. "I'm so sorry," Emma kept saying. "I should have checked the locks before you left. I should have done more." But none of this was her fault. It was my family's fault. My mother's fault. And as I sat there in Mrs. Patterson's flower-filled living room, holding my son and stroking his hair while he slowly fell asleep against my shoulder, I made a decision. Whatever my parents were hiding, whatever they'd done, I wasn't going to protect them anymore. Not when it put Caleb at risk. Not when it violated my home and my safety. When Officer Grant came to tell me that I could go back into my apartment if I wanted to, that they'd secured the scene and removed the most critical evidence, I carefully transferred Caleb to Emma's arms and stood up. "I need to tell you something," I said to him, "about my parents, about what I found." And so, standing in a stranger's living room at almost midnight on my 29th birthday, I told a police officer about the box I'd discovered, about the property deeds, and the bank statements, and the offshore account numbers I'd photographed, but not fully understood. I told him about my mother's whispered conversation at dinner, about her sending Nathan to change my locks, about the way they'd both looked when they heard there was police tape at my door. Officer Grant listened without interrupting, taking notes in his small notebook, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Morgan," he finally said, "I'm going to need you to send me those photos. And I'm going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow to make a formal statement. Because what you're describing sounds a lot like tax fraud and identity theft." "Identity theft?" I repeated, confused. "But those are their properties." He looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Are they? Or are they in your name?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In my name? Why would they be in my name? But even as I asked myself the question, I knew the answer, because I was the accountant in the family, the one with the clean credit, the one who worked in finance and would have plausible deniability if anyone ever looked too closely. They'd used me. They'd been using me, and I hadn't even known it. I spent that night in a hotel room with Caleb, neither of us able to sleep in my apartment with its broken door and violated spaces. I lay awake in the dark, listening to my son's steady breathing, thinking about all the times my parents had asked me to sign things, papers they said were for family trusts or business entities, documents they assured me were routine. I'd signed them all without question, trusting them because they were my parents, because family was supposed to mean something. But family, I was learning, could be the most dangerous trust of all. The next morning, my phone started ringing before dawn. My mother, my father, Nathan, all of them calling repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that I didn't listen to. I turned my phone to silent, got Caleb dressed and fed, and took him to my friend Maya's house in Laurelhurst. Maya had been my roommate in college, one of the few people who'd known me before the Morgan family name meant anything, before I'd learned to navigate the complicated politics of a family that valued image over everything. "You look like hell," Maya said when she opened the door, taking in my rumpled clothes and the dark circles under my eyes. "I need you to watch Caleb for a few hours," I said. "And I need you not to tell anyone he's here, especially not my family." Maya's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Rebecca, what's going on?" I told her everything. The break-in, the message, what I'd found in my parents' garage, and as I spoke, I watched her face change, watched the same realization dawn that had kept me awake all night. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Rebecca, they've been using you." "I know. You have to go to the police." "I am?" I said. "I'm going right now." But I needed to make sure Caleb was safe first. She pulled me into a tight hug. "He'll be fine here. We'll watch movies and make pancakes. You go do what you need to do." The Portland Police Bureau's downtown precinct was a modern building of glass and concrete. Imposing in that way, government buildings always are. I'd driven past it hundreds of times, but never imagined I'd be walking through its doors to report my own parents for fraud. Officer Grant met me in the lobby and led me to a small conference room where Detective Sandra Hayes was waiting. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that made me feel slightly less terrified. "Miss Morgan," she said, shaking my hand. "Officer Grant briefed me on your situation. I understand you have evidence of potential financial crimes involving your parents." Evidence. Such a clean, official word for what I was about to do. Betray my family. Destroy my parents' lives. Become the Morgan family traitor. But I thought about Caleb, about the message on my coffee table, about the way my mother had so casually sent Nathan to invade my privacy, and I pulled out my phone. "I have photos," I said, "of documents from my parents' house." For the next 2 hours, I went through everything I'd photographed. Property deeds in Bend, Eugene, and Salem, none of which had ever been mentioned in any conversation I'd had with my parents. Bank statements from accounts at institutions I'd never heard them use, and most damning of all, incorporation papers for several LLCs, all of them listing me as the registered agent, all of them signed with what looked like my signature but that I had no memory of signing. Detective Hayes examined each photo carefully, asking questions about dates and contexts, about what I remembered signing and what I didn't. And with each question the picture became clearer and more horrifying. "Ms. Morgan," she finally said, setting down her tablet, "based on what you've shown me, it appears your parents have been using your identity to hide assets from federal tax authorities. These properties, these accounts, they're all technically in your name, which means legally you're responsible for them." "But I didn't know about them," I protested. "I believe you," she said. "And that's why we're going to open an investigation, but I need you to understand the seriousness of this. If we can prove that your parents forged your signature and used your identity without your knowledge, then you're a victim of identity theft. But if we can't prove that, if there's any indication that you were a willing participant, even just by signing papers without reading them carefully, then you could be charged as an accomplice." The room seemed to spin. "I trusted them," I whispered. "They're my parents." "I know," Detective Hayes said, and her voice was gentler now. "But the IRS doesn't care about family dynamics. They care about who's legally responsible. So we need to move quickly and carefully. I'm going to need you to go through every document you can find, everything you've ever signed for them, and we're going to compare signatures. We're going to pull financial records and look for patterns of where money has been moving. And most importantly, we're going to find out if your parents paid Thomas Hale to break into your apartment." "You think they hired him?" But even as I asked, I knew it was true. Of course they'd hired him. They'd found out I had those documents somehow, Maybe Nathan had mentioned seeing me with a box that day, and they'd panicked. They'd hired someone to retrieve them before I could do exactly what I was doing now. "We're tracing the payment," Officer Grant said. "Thomas Hale had $5,000 deposited into his account last week from an account registered to a Patricia Morgan. Your mother." There it was. Proof. My mother had paid someone to break into my apartment, to violate my home, to threaten me with that message about truth. And she'd done it because she knew I'd found their secrets, and she couldn't let me expose them. "I want to file charges," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "Against both of them. For identity theft, for fraud, for whatever you can charge them with." Detective Hayes nodded. "We'll start the process. But Ms. Morgan, I need you to be prepared for what comes next. This is going to get ugly. Your family will fight back. They'll hire lawyers. They'll probably try to paint you as a disgruntled daughter, making false accusations. And it's going to be public. Once we file charges, the media will pick it up, especially given your father's position in the Portland business community." "I don't care," I said. And I meant it. Let them fight. Let them hire lawyers. Let the whole world know what they'd done. Because the alternative was living in fear, was letting them continue to use me, was teaching my son that family loyalty meant accepting abuse and manipulation and crime. "There's one more thing," Officer Grant added. "We found something else in Thomas Hale's apartment when we arrested him. He had documents, copies of the same papers you photographed, along with a letter that was supposed to be delivered to your mother directly, not left in your apartment. We think he panicked when your babysitter almost caught him, left the envelope as a warning instead of delivering it as planned." "What did the letter say?" I asked. Detective Hayes and Officer Grant exchanged a look. "It was more explicit than the message you found," Hayes said carefully. "It detailed specific accounts, specific properties, and it threatened to send all of the information to the IRS and the FBI unless your mother paid him blackmail. Thomas Hale hadn't just been hired by my mother, he'd been blackmailing her. He'd taken the job to break into my apartment, seen the opportunity to make even more money, and tried to extort her. Which meant my mother knew exactly what I'd found, knew exactly how damaging it could be, and had been desperate enough to hire a criminal to get it back. "She's going to know I talked to you," I said suddenly. "As soon as you start investigating, she's going to know it was me." "Probably," Detective Hayes agreed. "Which is why we need to move fast. I'm going to get a warrant for their financial records today. We'll freeze the accounts, prevent them from moving any more money or destroying evidence. And we're going to bring them in for questioning." "When?" My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Tomorrow," she said. "We move tomorrow." I left the police station in a daze, the October sun too bright after the fluorescent lights inside. My phone was still blowing up with calls and messages from my family, but I didn't check them. Instead, I drove to Maya's house, picked up Caleb and took him to his favorite playground in Laurelhurst Park. I pushed him on the swings and caught him at the bottom of the slide and pretended that everything was normal, that his grandmother hadn't used his mother's identity to commit federal crimes, that by this time tomorrow, his grandparents might be under arrest. He laughed and played, innocent and unburdened, and I held on to that sound like a lifeline. That evening, after I'd put Caleb to bed in the hotel room we were still staying in, I finally opened my voicemail. 23 messages, most of them from my mother. The first few were concerned, asking where I was, if I was okay after the incident at my apartment. But as the day went on, her tone changed. By message number 15, she wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding, "Rebecca, you need to call me right now. We need to talk about what you've been telling the police. This is serious. This could destroy our family." Message number 20 was my father, his voice cold and controlled. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you found, you're making a mistake. Call us immediately, so we can straighten this out before you do something you'll regret." The last message was Nathan, and he sounded terrified. "Please talk to them. Mom's freaking out. Dad won't tell me what's going on, but I know it's bad. Please. They're our parents." I deleted all the messages without responding. They could wait, they could wonder, they could panic. Because tomorrow Detective Hayes was moving forward with the investigation, and there would be nothing any of them could do to stop it. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the times I'd defended my parents to friends who didn't understand our family dynamic. All the times I'd made excuses for their controlling behavior, their manipulation, their demands. I'd told myself that was just how they were, that they came from a different generation, that they showed love through criticism and control because that was how they'd been raised. But this wasn't love. This had never been love. This was using your own child as a shield for criminal activity. This was violating her home and threatening her safety when she discovered the truth. This was choosing money and image over everything else, including the grandbabies they claimed to adore. The next morning, Detective Hayes called at exactly 9 o'clock. "We have the warrant," she said. "We're executing it now. I wanted to let you know before you see it on the news." "Thank you," I managed to say. "Ms. Morgan, your parents are going to call you. Probably within the hour. Don't answer. Don't engage with them at all. Anything you say could complicate the investigation." I promised I wouldn't, but she was wrong about the timing. My mother called within 10 minutes, and when I didn't answer, she called again, and again, and again. By the time I'd gotten Caleb dressed and fed, I had 43 missed calls. Then the text started. "How could you do this to us? After everything we've done for you? You're destroying this family over a misunderstanding. The police are at our house, our home, Rebecca. Explain yourself immediately." I blocked their numbers. All of them. My mother, my father, Nathan. I blocked them and turned off my phone and took Caleb to the Oregon Zoo, where we spent the day looking at elephants and penguins and pretending that the world wasn't falling apart. But I couldn't hide forever. That evening, when I finally turned my phone back on, I had 3 voicemails from Detective Hayes and one from a number I didn't recognize. I listened to Hayes first. "Ms. Morgan, we've seized multiple computers, hard drives, and file boxes from your parents' home. The initial review confirms what you suspected. There are properties in your name that you didn't know about, accounts using your social security number, forged signatures on multiple documents. We're building a strong case for identity theft and tax fraud. Call me when you can." The unknown number was a reporter from the Oregonian, asking if I wanted to comment on the situation involving my parents and allegations of financial misconduct. I deleted it without finishing. This was really happening. There was no going back now. The investigation was underway, the evidence was being processed, and soon the whole city would know that Richard and Patricia Morgan, pillars of the Portland business community, were frauds who'd used their own daughter to hide their crimes. 3 days later, I sat in Detective Hayes' office, looking at printouts of documents they'd found on my father's computer. Property deeds, all bearing my signature. Bank account applications, all using my information. Tax returns, filed under my social security number, but for income I'd never earned from properties I'd never known I owned. "We brought in a forensic document examiner," Hayes explained. "She compared these signatures to verified samples of your handwriting. It's clear that most of them are forgeries. Someone traced your signature from other documents, probably ones you'd legitimately signed for them in the past, and used that to create these." "My own father," I said, staring at the papers. "He forged my signature." "It appears so. And your mother facilitated it by setting up the accounts and managing the properties. They were hiding income from a side real estate investment business, one that your father ran separate from his main company. They'd buy properties under your name, rent them out, and pocket the income without reporting it. When the properties appreciated, they'd sell them, again under your name, and move the money to offshore accounts." "How much?" I asked. "How much money are we talking about?" Detective Hayes pulled out another document, and the number at the bottom made my stomach drop. "Based on what we've found so far, about $2.3 million over the past 8 years. $2.3 million. They'd made $2.3 million using my identity. and I'd been completely oblivious. I'd signed things they'd asked me to sign, trusting them, never imagining they'd use me like this. What happens now? I asked. Now we turn everything over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'll decide whether to file federal charges. But Ms. Morgan, based on what we've uncovered, I'd say charges are virtually certain. Your parents are looking at federal tax evasion, identity theft, wire fraud, and possibly money laundering. And me? You're clear. The evidence clearly shows you were a victim, not a participant. You'll need to work with the IRS to clear your name from these properties and accounts, but criminally, you're not at risk. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was numb. My parents were going to prison. My family was destroyed, and everyone in Portland would know what they'd done, what they'd made me an unwitting part of. There's one more thing, Hayes said, and something in her tone made me look up. We found emails between your mother and Thomas Hale. She hired him to break into your apartment and retrieve specific documents, the ones from that box you found. But when he saw what was in them, he tried to blackmail her. The message he left was his way of pressuring her to pay. But she called the police instead? I asked, confused. No, your babysitter called the police. Your mother was probably planning to pay him. But the break-in got interrupted. After that, there was too much scrutiny. She couldn't make contact with him without looking suspicious. So she'd hired a criminal. The criminal had turned on her, and in trying to cover up one crime, she'd exposed all the others. There was a certain justice in that, I supposed. When will they be arrested? I asked. Soon. The U.S. Attorney wants to review everything first. Make sure the case is airtight, but it's coming. I'd say within the week. I nodded, stood up, shook her hand. Thank you, Detective, for believing me. You did the right thing, Miss Morgan. Not many people would have the courage to turn in their own parents, but you protected yourself and your son. That takes strength, but it didn't feel like strength as I walked out of the police station into the gray Portland afternoon. It felt like betrayal, even though I knew logically that I wasn't the one who'd betrayed anyone. They'd betrayed me first, long before I ever picked up that phone to call the police. That night, I finally returned to my apartment. The locks had been changed by the building management, and the door had been repaired. Inside, everything looked the same as I'd left it, except now I knew that someone had been here, had gone through my things, had looked at photos of my son and me, and seen us not as people but as leverage, as tools to be used in whatever scheme my parents had running. I turned all the picture frames back face up, and as I did, my phone rang. Not my parents this time, not Nathan. A number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. Hello, Miss Morgan? This is Jennifer Reeves from Channel 8 News. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your parents and the ongoing investigation. I hung up. This was just the beginning. Soon, every news outlet in the city would be calling, would want the daughter's perspective, would want me to talk about how it felt to discover that my parents were criminals. But I didn't owe anyone my story. Not the reporters, not my parents, and certainly not the Portland society crowd that had always looked at the Morgans as some kind of ideal family. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them learn the truth when it came out in court. A week later, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Portland businessman Richard Morgan and wife Patricia Morgan arrested on federal fraud charges. Daughter listed as victim. I read the article, sitting on my couch, with Caleb playing at my feet. It detailed the charges, the properties, the hidden income. It quoted the U.S. Attorney talking about a sophisticated scheme to evade federal taxes. It mentioned me only briefly, noting that I had cooperated with investigators and was not suspected of any wrongdoing. The comment section was already filling up. Some people defended my parents, claimed this was a witch hunt, a family dispute blown out of proportion. Others praised me for coming forward, called me brave. Many just gossiped, speculated about family drama, wondered what Thanksgiving dinners would be like now. I closed the article without reading more. What strangers thought didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was out now. documented, and undeniable. My parents couldn't hurt me anymore, couldn't use me anymore, and Caleb would grow up, knowing that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing up to the people who were supposed to protect you. That afternoon, I took Caleb to Laurelhurst Park again. We fed the ducks at the pond, and he ran through the fallen leaves laughing. And for a few hours I let myself forget about federal investigations and family betrayals, and just watched my son be happy. My phone rang. Maya. I answered. Have you seen the news? She asked. Yeah. How are you doing? I watched Caleb chase a squirrel, his little legs pumping, his jacket unzipped and flapping behind him, despite the chill in the air. I'm okay, I said, and realized I meant it. I'm actually okay. Your brother has been calling me, Maya said carefully. He wants to talk to you. He says he didn't know what they were doing. Do you believe him? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know, but he sounded genuinely shocked and scared. I thought about Nathan, the good son, the obedient one. Had he really not known? Or had he just not wanted to know? Had he chosen willful ignorance over confronting our parents? I'm not ready, I said. Maybe someday, but not now. That's fair, Maya agreed. Take all the time you need. And Rebecca, I'm proud of you. After we hung up, I sat on the park bench and thought about what came next. The trial, whenever it happened. Testifying, probably. Watching my parents face the consequences of what they'd done, and then somehow, building a life after all of this. A life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, or wonder what my family was hiding, or fear that my home would be violated again. It wouldn't be easy. But sitting there in the October sunshine, watching my son play, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. I felt free. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur of normalcy punctuated by reminders of the investigation. I went to work. I took care of Caleb. I had coffee with Maya. I started seeing a therapist to process everything that had happened. And through it all, my phone stayed silent. No calls from my mother. No texts from my father. Nathan tried once, leaving a voicemail that I deleted without listening to. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early December. Detective Hayes kept me updated on the evidence they were compiling, the witness list, the prosecution's strategy. My parents had hired expensive lawyers, a whole team from some white shoe firm downtown, and those lawyers were doing what expensive lawyers do, filing motions, challenging evidence, trying to paint the investigation as overreach. But the facts were the facts. The forged signatures, the hidden properties, the unreported income. No amount of legal maneuvering could make those disappear. They're going to try to claim you knew. Detective Hayes warned me during one of our meetings that you benefited from the properties, that you were complicit. It's standard defense strategy. Blame the victim, muddy the waters. Will it work? I asked. Not with the evidence we have. But it's going to be uncomfortable. You need to be prepared for your own parents to lie about you under oath. I already was prepared. I'd spent 29 years watching my parents manipulate situations to their advantage, watching them twist reality to fit whatever narrative served them best. Of course they'd lie about me. I'd have been more surprised if they didn't. The trial date was set for March. 4 months away. 4 months of waiting, of living in this strange limbo between my old life and whatever came next. I used that time to start putting distance between myself and everything Morgan. I changed my last name back to my mother's maiden name from before she married, Hughes. Rebecca Hughes sounded like someone new, someone who didn't carry the weight of that family history. I put my Pearl District apartment on the market and found a smaller place in northeast Portland, near Beaumont. It wasn't as fancy, didn't have the same prestige address, but it felt safer, further from the world my parents moved in. And I started to build a new life, one where I didn't have to explain my family, or make excuses for them, or wonder what they were hiding. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. On a cold morning in December, I sat in a federal courtroom for the preliminary hearing. My parents were at the defense table, both dressed immaculately, both wearing expressions of dignified offense, as if they were the wronged parties in all of this. My father's lawyer was arguing that the charges were based on misunderstanding, that his client had simply been trying to protect family assets, that any irregularities were clerical errors at worst. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 50s, named Catherine Marks, dismantled those arguments methodically. She presented the forged documents, the financial records, the emails between my mother and Thomas Hale. She showed the pattern of deception, spanning nearly a decade. And then she called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth. And I did. I told the truth about finding the documents about the break-in, about signing papers I didn't understand, because I trusted my parents. I told the truth about discovering that my identity had been stolen, that my name had been used to hide their crimes, that when I found out, they'd tried to intimidate me into silence. My mother's lawyer cross-examined me, tried to suggest I'd known all along that I was making these claims now because of some unspecified family dispute. But every question he asked, I answered calmly, truthfully, and by the end, even he seemed to realize he was only making things worse for his clients. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial. Bail was set at $500,000 each. My father paid it immediately, had the money ready, and within an hour both my parents were back home in Beaverton, free until the trial began. I thought I'd feel something when I saw them in court. Anger, maybe, or sadness, or some complicated mix of emotions I couldn't name. But mostly I just felt tired of the whole thing, tired of having to relive it, tired of having my life picked apart by lawyers and judges and reporters. That night, I got an email from Nathan. Not a call, not a text, an email like we were business associates instead of siblings. Bickett, it said, I know you don't want to talk to me. I understand why, but I need you to know that I didn't know what they were doing. I thought those papers you signed were legitimate. I thought the properties were real investments. I didn't know they were using your identity. I should have questioned things more, should have pushed back when things seemed off. But I didn't. I was a coward and I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And I'm proud of you for doing what I never had the courage to do. Love, Nathan. I read it 3 times, then closed my laptop without responding. Maybe Nathan really hadn't known. Maybe he'd been as deceived as I was, just in different ways. But the truth was, even if he hadn't known the details, he'd known something was wrong. He'd known our parents were manipulative, controlling, willing to bend rules to get what they wanted. And he'd chosen to look the other way, to be the good son, to not rock the boat. That was his choice. And now he'd have to live with it. Christmas came and went. I spent it with Maya and her family, letting Caleb open presents under their tree, eating cookies and watching him play with his new toys. It was quiet and simple and perfect, and I didn't think about my parents' empty chairs or the family traditions we'd broken, or the Christmases we'd never have together again. The new year arrived. January, February, and finally March. The trial began on a rainy Monday morning, the kind of gray, drizzly day that Portland specializes in. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a few of my parents' friends who still believed they were innocent. The prosecution's case took 3 days to present. They called bank officials, handwriting experts, IRS agents, all testifying to the elaborate scheme my parents had constructed. They showed the jury emails, financial records, property deeds. They built an irrefutable case that Richard and Patricia Morgan had systematically defrauded the federal government, using their daughter's identity. The defense tried to argue that this was all legitimate business practice, that there had been no intent to deceive, that the use of my name was with my knowledge and consent. They called character witnesses, who testified to my parents' good standing in the community, their charitable work, their reputation as upstanding citizens. But they couldn't explain the forged signatures. They couldn't explain why properties bought in my name had never been disclosed to me. They couldn't explain the emails to Thomas Hale about retrieving documents from my apartment. On the 4th day, The defense rested without calling either of my parents to testify. Their lawyers had probably advised them that putting them on the stand would do more harm than good, that anything they said would be torn apart by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 48 hours of waiting, of checking my phone constantly, of trying to distract myself with work and Caleb and anything except thinking about 12 strangers deciding my parents' fate. The verdict came down on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Federal tax evasion, identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering. My father's face remained impassive as the verdict was read. My mother cried, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the wronged victim even then. But it was over. They'd been found guilty, and now all that remained was sentencing. That came 6 weeks later. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen every trick in the book, sentenced my father to 7 years in federal prison. My mother got 5, partly because she cooperated more toward the end, partly because she'd played a slightly lesser role in setting up the scheme. 7 years. 5 years. It seemed simultaneously too much and not nearly enough. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. Detective Hayes called to tell me the outcome, and I thanked her and hung up and sat on my couch in my new apartment, feeling nothing. They were gone now. Really gone. Not just arrested or on trial, but convicted and sentenced and heading to federal prison. The parents who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with my homework and come to my college graduation, were criminals, and I was the one who'd turned them in. Mom? Caleb appeared in the doorway of his room, holding his stuffed elephant. Are you okay? I opened my arms and he climbed onto the couch with me, snuggling against my side. I'm okay, baby, I said, kissing the top of his head. Everything's going to be okay now. And slowly, gradually, it was. The media attention faded. The reporters stopped calling. Life moved forward, the way it always does, even after everything falls apart. I sold my story to a journalist working on a book about white-collar crime and family dysfunction. Not because I wanted the money, though I donated it all to a foundation that helped victims of identity theft, but because I wanted my version on record somewhere. I wanted people to understand that family loyalty shouldn't mean complicity, that protecting yourself isn't betrayal, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is tell the truth even when it destroys everything you thought you knew. Nathan reached out again, a year after the trial. This time, I answered. We met for coffee at a place in Selwood, neutral territory, and talked for 3 hours. He told me he'd moved out of our parents' house, had gotten his own apartment in Northwest. He'd quit working for Dad's company and was doing freelance marketing work. He was in therapy, trying to unpack 20 years of being the good son who never questioned anything. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. But I want you to know I'm trying to be better, to see things more clearly. I know, I said, and I did. I could see in his eyes that he meant it, that he was genuinely trying to change. I'm trying too. We didn't become close after that. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done. But we stayed in touch, the way distant relatives do. Birthday texts, photos of Caleb at Christmas. Small connections that didn't require us to pretend the past hadn't happened. 2 years after the trial, I met someone. His name was Daniel. He was a teacher at Caleb's school, and he knew nothing about the Morgan family scandal. To him, I was just Rebecca Hughes, a financial analyst who was good with numbers and loved her kid fiercely. We took things slow, built something real, something based on honesty, instead of the performative perfection I'd grown up thinking family was supposed to be. 3 years after the trial, my mother was released early for good behavior. She served 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence. She wrote me a letter, asking if we could meet. I didn't respond. Maybe someday I would be ready for that conversation. But not yet. Not while Caleb was still young, still innocent. Not while I was still building this new life. My father still has 2 years left on his sentence. He hasn't written. I don't expect him to. In his mind, I'm probably the one who betrayed him, who destroyed everything he built. He'll never understand that he destroyed it himself the moment he decided to forge my signature on that first document, to use his own daughter as a shield for his crimes. Now, standing in my kitchen in Northeast Portland, watching Caleb do his homework at the dining table while Daniel chops vegetables for dinner, I think about that night at the Sentinel Hotel. My 29th birthday, when I heard my mother whisper those words that changed everything. If I could go back and stop myself from hearing it, from knowing what I know now, would I? No! Because knowing meant I could protect myself, protect my son, break a cycle of manipulation and control that might have continued for another generation. Knowing meant I could build something different, something better, something based on truth instead of secrets. The truth did find its way home, just like that message said, and it destroyed my family in the process. But from those ruins, I built something new, something smaller, quieter, but infinitely more honest. And that, I've learned, is worth everything. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone special. Leave us a comment about what you felt, and subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories. Because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.